Hi, Anna.
Hi, Susan. How are you?
I'm okay. Hi,
That,
Fortunate. I can see he's asking if is this the ICAN IPC webinar.
yes, I see that Dr. Shaim has
complicated because it deals with people, and frameworks are often written with people in mind. So in the WHO's framework, these were the sections that they covered. So EMS, as you know, is pre-hospital. So issues like scene control and care was listed. They talk about PPE and training. They talk about policies. They talk about screening tools, and then IPC guidelines in place. And each of these components were covered in the framework, and so they were useful to shape our lessons around. So the first part of one of the key sections is around adequate PPE. Interestingly, we started preparing for COVID in January, late January, and February, early February of 2020. That's quite considerable, considering that it's mid-Jan that they identified and started raising the issue of a possible outbreak. And the reason for it is that EMS traditionally is the response team or response unit for biomedical and hazardous and chemical biological agents. And so prior to that, we'd been trained for FIFA 2010, and as part of that preparations and World Cup preparations, we needed to, refurbish many of the things. And so at that time, it became just one of those routine things we needed to do. Oh, we need to learn how to deal with a highly contagious viral pandemic or viral pathogen. And so when we started training at that time, we knew very little about the virus, and so we trained with full suits, N95 masks, but A60 suits, in fact, was the training that we had at the time. And then, as things evolved and changed, and we now needed to do, instead of sending 2 or 3 people out to a response, we now had to do a systems-wide response. This presented significant issues for us because we then had to go back and train people differently. So initially we said, "Oh, it's A60 suits. It wasn't the A60. You don't have to worry. It's now A40 suits. And at the time, and then we said, "Oh, even not in A40 suits. It's just aprons. A40 is if there's risk of aerosolization, and high risk agents." And so what we encountered was mistrust, like staff just like, "You said it was this, and now you say it's this. No. I think you're saying that because it's too expensive, And this was in the context, and so very early on, what the department did really well, what National did really well, was there was a clear policy, sent out frequent correspondence and communication and guidelines around, what do you use and when do you use it and so forth. And so in that context, we still had staff saying, no, I don't believe you. And that was because we taught them one thing, and then we were teaching them another thing, and then we were coming back and teaching them a third thing as the pandemic unfolded and as we learned more about the virus. And it's no surprise that we had huge staff mistrust. So the first thing to deal with was the issue of trust amongst the staff at a time when there was lots of ignorance around what this virus is. There was lots of reporting about deaths, and you can recall that time what was happening in Italy and in Greece, and the horror stories and the pictures that we'd seen out of there. So staff were scared. They were extremely fearful. The team, myself and Stuart, who was the operations chief, particularly in the city, because the pandemic had sort of started showing signs in the city, engaged with our staff every single shift, when they were available, we took them off the shift and had to engage that. So this was on duty time, and it was whole. As you can see, that's a whole shift. That's at these sessions that we had. It's also strange to see that, because not a single person's wearing a mask. It was the early days, and we certainly didn't look at social distance in the way it evolved over then. And the problem of distance was both physical, as you can see, staff we hadn't really made it our behavior yet, but also ideological. Staff insisted that they wanted their A60 suits. They wanted what we taught, and they didn't want anything else. We were saying, look, there's just no way. If we give you A60 suits, by the time we respond in 2 weeks, there won't be any suits for anybody to wear. So we do need to use it rationally. And this idea of rationally at the time when people are fearful and emotional, rationality is not something you can rely on. And not surprisingly, we had tools down. We had 3 days of unprecedented work stoppage in one of the stations. We'd been through, I've been in EMS for 20 years. In all of that time, we've never had a single instance of work stoppage. And this continued for 3 days. There have been ultimatums, there have been posturing, engagement with labor, a formal organized labor without any progress. Eventually, we made some way to get staff back, but ultimately it cost them 3 days of pay. Some of those relationships were irrevocably broken. I lost a few staff members who just left the organization because they didn't feel that they were valued or that relationship soured for them. So that was just a consequence of failure. Linked to that, these were social media. As governments, we're terrible with social media. Staff are much better with it. And so we had these on Twitter, on Facebook, all the social media platforms, staff engaging and spreading more mistrust and rumors than actual facts. And we just weren't able to counter that because of the way we choose to communicate as government. So that was a lesson I wouldn't say we've learned it because we're still not very good at dealing with social media. And so we really lost that one in trying to remedy the relationship. So the next part I'm going to speak about is operations. So one of the key things that came out of it is an innovation that came out is a mode of training. So to train people, an entire workforce, we have 2,000 staff, 1,600 of them are operational. 1,600 of them are spread across the province, so are separated by hundreds and hundreds of kilometers. And so we had to figure out how do we teach them the changing protocols, the changing information, and these things are changing weekly. What was considered adequate response at one point and what was considered safe practices were changing almost on a daily basis. And so we developed a way of training in the back of an ambulance in small numbers, 15 to 20 minutes. And we were able to roll this out to 1,200 staff quite quickly. We trained them up on 3 main sections. The first was PPE, the second was clinical guidelines, and then the third one was decontamination and cleaning. So those are the 3 modules, and we did that 1,600 staff all in a week with one module a week, which is quite remarkable. Mostly we did it because we needed to wait for them to come on shift in order to teach them in that time. So that's just pictures of them, and then part of it was availability of safe resources. So the third module was around how do you make your workplace safe, and that was also really take-home messages. It literally took 15 to 20 minutes to go through the content, demonstrate the practical skill, and test the acquisition of knowledge, which was very useful because we had to do this in small groups. If we had to bring people into a class, we just wouldn't be able to do that. Also at the time, socialize 30 people in a classroom was just not something that was safe to do. So that was the third module. And then a link to that was decontamination and disinfection processes. And so these are pictures taken out of the training modules and things that staff did themselves. So the picture on the right is a container that was essentially just waste. And eventually we didn't really use that container, but why I'm highlighting it is because these were things initiated by the staff. These weren't decisions taken by managers. This was either the OHS, the safety officer, someone that did that. Similarly, marking out areas were staff, and the OHS teams were incredible and would take those initiatives, and then they'd share what those lessons were and where they'd made progress. Not all the lessons were shareable. Some of the lessons were really dodgy, questionable, but it didn't stop people from sharing, and it meant learning was really rapid. I'm going to see if this works. So this is just a video. I won't play the whole thing. I'm not sure if there's sound.
Dr. De Vries, there's no sound, so you just need to...
Okay, so I'll just talk. Thanks. So this is, sorry, Kubeni was talking a little bit about an introduction and just saying to people, this is important for us to educate, and thank you for being there. And so now they just, these are just, I won't play the whole thing, but this is a video in which the narrator explains what to do and says, okay, well, you've got to don your equipment before you open up the vehicle, and identifies what the proper PPE is, eye protection, the apron. And now I'm saying open the slide door first to get our ventilation, and then open your back doors. Yeah. So now they're just opening up. And so these videos were taken by the team themselves. They were choreographed, worked out by the training unit, and they were done in such a way that they were WhatsAppable. So you could share it on social media. Yeah. So I'm going to stop it now. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. So sorry about the sound there. So essentially, those were with each module that they sent out. There was a video material because of the nature of the pandemic. We had to disseminate it that way, and so staff were able to engage with the material then, and all of that was developed in a matter of days, 2 weeks. From the time identifying the need for the module to deployment was, in fact, not more than 2 weeks, and that was with material and everything. So, and I was trying to figure out how to do it as well. The next part was part of the department, and that is assessment. So we did quite a lot of assessments in the broader department around risk assessment and how to keep staff, particularly the vulnerable staff, safe. But it started with needing to screen and introduce what we now take for granted, but at the time was really difficult and unprecedented. The flow diagram at the bottom was from the provincial OHS team, and that was around how do you identify PUIs, how do you identify who must be isolated or who must be quarantined, and at that time, these were really challenging problems. This is just a sample of the amazing material that the department produced. They weren't EMS specific, but in the way they were produced, we used to, as EMS, to sort of extract from what is sent out, what is applicable to us. But this is just a sliver of it. There were so many more out throughout the pandemic, and still even now. I think we then labeled every circular, and we are now sitting, I think, at 160 circulars since the pandemic started that deals with COVID specifically. And most of those came out in the first few months. It was just having access to that was quite important as a manager, but also as a team trying to deal with patients and staff fears. So what are the take-home points? The first one is that the importance of finding some framework. It doesn't even have to be very good, just to allow you to process what is a really complex situation. Just gives you somewhere to start if you don't know where to start. And then the second point is many of these things, like the training or the capabilities, were emergent. We didn't get on day one and say, okay, this is what we're going to do. And an example is that the training. We had to train 3 or 4 very different guidelines around PPE, and we had to do that in short succession. And so figuring out how to do it, figuring out how to build trust, figuring out how to scale it was all done on the fly, and was also done for the context. The third point, the issues around what is on paper and what is in practice is an important thing to consider. And much of the challenges that we had with staff was this tension, the tension between what happens on paper and how people and academics write it down versus how practitioners live it. And that required an agility and a flexibility on the management team and the trainers and the OHS coordinators. OHS tend to be quite policeman-like and quite rigid around how they approach things, because under routine times, that's what OHS is. But in fluid times and ambiguous times, what you need is wisdom and agility. And so fortunately for us, the team were able to adapt. And then the last point, this adaptation and this agility is, we learned a great deal, and we continue, like everyone else, learn a great deal about what we thought we knew and what we found to be not to be true, but also about the strength, the intelligence, the creativity that existed within the organization. So it was I wouldn't want to go through it again, but it certainly was a wonderful time to learn, to explore, to experiment. So maybe when all the dust settles, that's the one thing we'll take home from this experience. So that's my talk. Thank you very much. Not much. 20 minutes is a very short time, so I apologize if I didn't do justice to the talk. But I hope you found it useful. Thanks, Anna.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shaheen. No, it was wonderful, and I think it's great to hear what you guys have done. There's quite a few questions and answers that we will take after this. Before I put Fortunate on, I just want to remind everybody that we do have Arabic and Portuguese translation at the same time. So it was grateful that Dr. Shaheen actually speak at a very good pace. It will help them as well. And after Fortunate's presentation, we will have a 5-minute break just for them to get a chance to rest their voice before we take on the third person. So I'm going to just again introduce Fortunate Mugabe. He's a laboratory technician at the school in let me just write here. He's at Harare at Salim Mugabe Central Hospital. He's the vice chairperson of the IPC committee, and he's also done his FIPC, that's fundamentals in IPC at Stellenbosch University, and he's also a postgraduate, a diploma student in infection control at the Bandura University that flow over from the one that we did through Stellenbosch, and that ICAN is also running currently with the Radboud University. So over to you, Fortunate, to share with us the laboratory impact with the COVID. Thank you, Fortunate. You can share your screen as well.
Okay, thank you, Anna. Let me share. Okay, thank you.
Yes, we can see your screen. You can carry on.
Okay, thank you so much, Anna, for the introduction. There's no need for me to introduce myself. You did it so well. So I'm just going to go through the presentation right away. Okay, I'm going to present on COVID-19 impact on IPC standards in Zimbabwe laboratories. And this is the outline of my presentation. I'm just going to give a brief background, going to talk a bit about COVID-19 infection rates in the electric we encountered the measures taken to try and address the gaps and the way forward. So, okay, so as we know, in reducing infections or healthcare workers, especially the COVID-19 pandemic. The Zimbabwean Infection Control and Prevention Project, the ZIPCOP, encouraged multidisciplinary involvement in programs, but did not take up the IPC programs. The efforts were made by the Ministry of Health and Healthcare to train every healthcare worker before the first wave of the COVID-19. Personnel participated in the trainings out of self-interest. You also realize that when COVID came, steps to be tested increased. There was high workload and staff burnout. Thereby, all this increased the transmission to laboratory. So, without proper in IPC, it became very difficult for laboratory people to cope with the pressure of work, at the same time trying to follow the additional use of PPE and other IPC measures. So with the short supply of PPE at most institutions, people, because they were so much afraid of disease, the Ebola suits which were provided, the situation was PPE was improperly doffed. So this is just the background.
Sorry,
so for the rates of infection by laboratories, hello, can you hear me?
You're breaking up a little bit. Can you just double check on your microphone? You keep on going in and out, so we can't hear you that clearly.
Okay. I think my network is a bit unstable, but can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So I just chose 8 laboratories in Zimbabwe. These laboratories cannot be a true representation of the whole country's laboratories, but they are very useful. There's very useful information that we can work with to give us the rates of infections by laboratories from April last year to July 31 this year. And as you can see, at the beginning of the pandemic, our testing was mostly centralized at the reference laboratory, and all samples were coming from all the provinces and were tested at the national laboratory. So you can see that we have 46% infected laboratory personnel, which is a high figure, and the private laboratories, you realize that the Ministry of Health and Child Care that I was talking about, they mostly send